I sat in that leather chair across from Mr. Langston's mahogany desk, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl, and watched my brother's face turn the color of old newspaper when the lawyer slid that single page across the polished wood. Raymond had been laughing just seconds before. That confident, dismissive laugh he'd perfected over the years, but now his mouth hung open, and I could see the exact moment he realized what Father had done. What Father had known he would try to do. It was 3 weeks after we'd buried our father, and my younger brother had just tried to steal my inheritance right out from under me, as casually as if he were taking the last cookie from a plate I'd baked myself. My name is Eleanor Whitaker, though most people call me Ellie, and I'm 81 years old this coming April. I've lived long enough to see the world change in ways I never could have imagined when I was a girl, but some things I've learned stay remarkably the same. Greed, for instance. Entitlement. The way some people can look right through you when you've outlived your usefulness to them. I'd seen all of that in Raymond's eyes when he'd called me the day of Father's funeral, his voice flat and businesslike, telling me he was taking over the yacht business, and I wouldn't be needed in any ownership capacity. Just like that. As if the previous 80 years of being his older sister, of loving him and protecting him and standing up for him, had evaporated the moment our father's heart stopped beating. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and that's the trouble with being old. Your mind wants to jump around like a stone skipping across water, touching down on all the painful spots at once instead of walking through them properly, the way you're supposed to. So let me start where I should have started, with Father, with Captain Henry Whitaker and the life he built from absolutely nothing. Father grew up poor. The kind of poor where you wear cardboard in your shoes because the soles have worn through and your family can't afford new ones. His own father had been a fisherman who died young, leaving behind a widow and 5 hungry children. And Father had been the oldest boy, which meant he'd gone to work at 14 on other men's boats, hauling nets until his hands bled, saving every penny he could scrape together. By 1958, when he was barely 23 years old, he'd saved enough to buy one beat-up fishing trawler that leaked in 3 places and smelled like dead fish no matter how many times you scrubbed the deck. He named her the Eleanor Marie, after our mother, who'd married him despite having every reason not to, despite her own parents practically disowning her for choosing a broke fisherman with calloused hands and big dreams. I was born in 1944, right in the middle of the war, and Raymond came along 6 years later, an unexpected gift when Mother thought she was done having babies. We grew up on the water, quite literally. Father would take us out on the boats as soon as we were old enough to wear a life jacket without slipping right through it. I loved everything about those days. The salt spray on my face, the cry of the gulls, the way the ocean stretched out forever like a promise of something bigger than our small lives. Father would point to the horizon and tell us that freedom lived out there, that the sea didn't care if you were rich or poor, educated or ignorant. It treated everyone exactly the same, with equal parts beauty and danger. Raymond never quite understood what Father meant by that, I don't think. He liked the boats well enough, but what he really loved was the attention they brought, the way people would point and wave when we'd pull into harbor, the way Father became somebody important instead of just another working man. By the time Raymond was 10, Father had expanded from that 1 trawler to 3 boats, then 5, then a small fleet. He'd figured out that rich people would pay good money to charter a yacht for a day, to pretend they were sailors and take pictures and drink champagne, while someone else did the actual work of keeping them safe. So he'd saved and invested and slowly, carefully, built Whitaker Yacht Charters into something real, something valuable. But Father never forgot where he'd come from, and he never forgot why he'd started in the first place. For every wealthy family that paid top dollar to sail around the bay, Father would donate time, sometimes a whole day, sometimes a whole week, to people who needed the ocean but could never afford it. Sick children from the hospital who'd never seen a whale, veterans who'd served on ships during the war and missed the water, search and rescue missions when storms blew in and smaller boats went missing. I remember him coming home exhausted after a 3-day search for a missing teenager, his face gray with fatigue, and Mother asking him why he pushed himself so hard when he didn't have to. He'd looked at her with those serious blue eyes and said, "The boats belong to the sea, Marie, and to the people who need them. If I forget that, what's the point of any of this?" I never forgot those words. I carried them with me through my whole life, through my marriage to Thomas, through raising my own daughter Clara, through the long years of widowhood after Thomas died of a heart attack at 59. I carried them through the difficult years when father started slowing down, when his mind stayed sharp as ever but his body began betraying him, when someone needed to step in and help manage the business he'd built. Raymond was in Europe then, newly married to his second wife, or was it his third? I'd lost count by then, and he'd call once a month maybe, to ask how father was doing, but he was always too busy to actually visit, too caught up in his own life to bother with the old man who'd given him everything. So I stepped in. I'd always helped with the books anyway, ever since Thomas died, and I'd needed something to fill the empty hours, so it wasn't a burden, not really. I'd drive to the office 3 times a week, make sure the charters were running smoothly, handle the paperwork, sit with father while he told me stories about the early days, when it had just been him and mother and one leaky boat with big dreams. On weekends, I'd bring him to the harbor so he could watch the yachts come and go. And sometimes, on his good days, we'd take one out ourselves, just the 2 of us, and he'd stand at the helm with his hands shaking but his eyes clear. And for a little while he'd be Captain Henry Whitaker again, not just an old man waiting to die. Those 6 years weren't always easy. Father had his stubborn moments, his bad days when the pain was too much and he'd snap at me for no reason, then apologize later with tears in his eyes. But mostly they were good years, precious years, the kind you don't realize are precious until they're gone, and you'd give anything to have just one more afternoon sitting on the deck together, watching the sun set over the water while he told you for the 100th time about the day he bought his first boat. Raymond visited exactly twice during those 6 years. Once for Christmas, when he stayed for 3 hours and spent most of that time on his phone, and once for father's 90th birthday, when he brought an expensive bottle of champagne that father couldn't drink because of his medications. Both times he left early, claiming urgent business matters, and both times father would grow quiet after he'd gone, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. I should have known then. I should have seen what father had already figured out, that Raymond had stopped seeing us as family and started seeing us as investments, as assets to be managed and eventually liquidated. But I didn't want to believe it. Raymond was my baby brother, the little boy I'd taught to swim, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, who'd cried on my shoulder when his first marriage fell apart. I kept making excuses for him, kept telling myself he was just busy, just stressed, just going through a difficult time. Father knew better. Father saw things clearly, the way people sometimes do when they're getting close to the end and all the pretenses fall away. And father, being father, had done something about it. He died on a Tuesday in November, quietly in his sleep, the way everyone hopes to go. The funeral was small. Father had outlived most of his friends, and he'd never been one for big gatherings anyway. Raymond showed up in an expensive black suit with his current wife beside him, a woman named Simone or Suzette or something that started with an S, and he'd hug me briefly at the cemetery, his cologne overwhelming, his eyes already distant. I'd thought maybe grief affected people differently, that maybe he was just processing father's death in his own way. But then he'd called me that evening, while I was sitting in father's study surrounded by a lifetime of memories, and his voice had been cool and professional, like he was talking to a stranger. The phone call came at 7:30 in the evening, just as the last light was fading from the sky outside father's study window. I'd been sitting in his leather chair, the one he'd bought secondhand in 1965 and refused to replace even when the armrest started splitting, going through his desk drawers slowly, carefully, the way you do when you're not really looking for anything specific, but you can't bear to leave either. Every piece of paper felt important somehow. Old receipts from marine supply stores, birthday cards I'd sent him over the years that he'd kept and filed away, a faded photograph of mother standing on the deck of that first boat, young and beautiful, and so full of hope it made my chest ache to look at her. When my phone rang, I almost didn't answer it. I was tired, bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from crying and not eating properly, and trying to hold yourself together when every cell in your body wants to collapse. But the screen showed Raymond's name, and some old instinct made me pick up, some deeply ingrained habit of being the responsible older sister, who always answered when her little brother called. He didn't ask how I was doing, didn't ask if I needed anything, if I was managing all right in the big empty house by myself. His first words were about the business, about father's estate, about moving forward efficiently so nothing fell through the cracks during the transition period. He used that exact phrase, transition period, as if Father's death was just another item on a corporate agenda, something to be handled and filed away and moved past as quickly as possible. I listened without saying much, my free hand running over the worn leather of Father's chair, and Raymond talked for maybe 5 minutes about logistics and timelines, and the importance of making decisive moves while everything was still fresh. Then he said it, the thing that would replay in my mind 1,000 times over the following weeks, each word etched into my memory like acid on glass. He told me he was taking over full operational control of Whitaker Yacht Charters, that he'd already been in contact with the corporate attorneys and the board, that everything was being arranged. And then, in that same flat, businesslike tone, he informed me that my ownership share would be eliminated, that at my age I didn't really need the complications of running a business anyway, that I should be grateful he was willing to let me keep the cottage on the north property, the little 2-bedroom place where I'd lived since Thomas died, because that was more than fair compensation for someone who'd just been helping out, not actually contributing to the company's growth, just helping out. Those 3 words hit me like a slap across the face. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What do you say when someone you've loved your entire life reduces 6 years of daily care, of sacrifice, of sitting with your dying father so he wouldn't be alone, to just helping out? What do you say when your own brother looks at everything you've done and sees nothing worth acknowledging? Raymond took my silence as agreement. He said something about drawing up the papers, about making this clean and simple for everyone involved, about how I'd thank him later for taking this burden off my shoulders. Then he said he had to go, that Simone, yes, it was Simone, was waiting for him to make dinner reservations, and he ended the call before I could find my voice. I sat there in the darkness for a long time after that, not moving, barely breathing. The study smelled like Father's old pipe tobacco, even though he'd quit smoking 20 years ago on doctor's orders. Some scents just live in a place, I suppose, soaking into the wood and the books and the memories until they become inseparable from the space itself. I breathed in that ghost of tobacco smoke and felt something breaking inside my chest, something that had been cracking for a while but had finally just shattered completely. The worst part wasn't even the theft, though that's what it was, make no mistake, theft dressed up in legal language and sibling authority. The worst part was realizing that Raymond genuinely believed he was being generous. He actually thought that letting me keep the cottage was a kindness, a favor he was doing me out of the goodness of his heart. He'd convinced himself that I hadn't really earned anything more, that showing up 3 times a week to manage the books and handle the charters and sit with Father through his bad nights wasn't real work, wasn't real contribution, wasn't worth a share of what Father had built. I thought about calling him back. I thought about screaming at him, about listing every single thing I'd done over the past 6 years while he was gallivanting around Europe with his various wives. I thought about reminding him who'd held Father's hand through every doctor's appointment, who'd reorganized the entire filing system when the business nearly failed an audit, who'd been there for every birthday and every holiday and every quiet Tuesday evening when Father just needed someone to sit with him and watch the sunset. But I didn't call. Something stopped me, maybe pride, maybe exhaustion, maybe just the bone-deep knowledge that people who don't see your worth on their own will never see it no matter how hard you try to show them. I'd learned that lesson before, years ago, when my own daughter Clara had moved across the country and slowly stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped including me in her life except for obligatory birthday cards and Christmas phone calls that felt more like duty than love. You can't make people value you. You can't force them to recognize your sacrifices or appreciate your presence. All you can do is decide what you're worth and hold on to that knowledge when everyone else forgets. So I sat in Father's chair and let myself feel the full weight of it. Not just Raymond's betrayal, but everything it represented. The loneliness of being 80 years old, and realizing that the people you'd spent your whole life loving might not actually love you back, not in any way that mattered. The fear of aging alone, of becoming invisible, of reaching the end of your life and wondering if any of it had meant anything to anyone besides yourself. The grief of losing not just Father, but the illusion that family meant something permanent and unbreakable. I must have fallen asleep in that chair eventually, because I woke up around midnight with a stiff neck, and my phone dead on the desk beside me. The house was completely dark and completely silent. and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what day it was or why my chest felt so hollow. Then it all came rushing back. Father's funeral that morning, Raymond's phone call that evening, the casual way he'd erase me from the family business as if I'd never mattered at all. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, watching car headlights sweep across the walls occasionally as someone drove down the quiet street outside. And my mind kept circling back to the same questions. Had I been naive? Had I been stupid to work all those years without demanding contracts, without protecting myself legally, without insisting on documentation of my contributions? Had I trusted too much, loved too blindly, believed too deeply in the goodness of people who'd never actually earned that belief? The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls and well-meaning neighbors dropping off casseroles I couldn't bring myself to eat. Raymond called twice more, both times to update me on the estate proceedings, both times maintaining that same cool professional distance, as if we were business associates instead of siblings. He mentioned the upcoming meeting with Mr. Langston, Father's corporate counsel, and told me I should attend to sign off on the property transfer for the cottage. He said it would be quick and painless, just a formality really, nothing to worry about. I said I'd be there. I didn't tell him that I'd already called Mr. Langston myself, that I'd asked some careful questions about Father's actual will and the corporate documents, and whether everything Raymond was saying aligned with what Father had actually wanted. Mr. Langston had been kind but cautious on the phone, telling me he couldn't discuss details until the official reading, but there'd been something in his voice, a gentleness maybe or a hint of concern, that made me think Father's plans might not be quite as simple as Raymond assumed. Still, I didn't let myself hope. Hope felt dangerous at that point, like something that would only lead to more disappointment, more heartbreak. I told myself I'd go to the meeting, sign whatever needed signing, take my cottage and my dignity and whatever small corner of peace I could carve out for myself. I told myself that losing the yachts didn't matter, that Father's legacy wasn't really about boats or money anyway, that I could find meaning in my life without needing validation from Raymond or anyone else. But late at night, alone in that too-big house, I let myself remember. I remembered Father's hands on the ship's wheel, steady and sure even when they started shaking. I remembered the way his eyes would light up when we'd take a sick child out for their first boat ride. The pure joy on his face when he could give someone a piece of the freedom he'd fought so hard to find for himself. The morning of the meeting dawned gray and cold, the kind of November day where the sky hangs low and heavy like it's pressing down on the world with both hands. I stood in front of my closet for longer than I should have, trying to decide what you wear when you're about to sign away your inheritance, about to watch your brother claim everything your father built while pretending it's for your own good. I settled on a navy blue dress, simple, dignified, the kind of thing that wouldn't draw attention but wouldn't apologize for existing either. My hands shook a little as I fastened the pearl necklace Thomas had given me for our 25th anniversary, and I had to stop and breathe slowly for a moment, reminding myself that I was 81 years old, and I'd survived worse than this. Though sitting there in that quiet bedroom, I honestly couldn't remember when. Mr. Langston's office was downtown in one of those old buildings with marble floors and brass fixtures that had been there since before I was born. Father had always insisted on using the same attorney, the same accountant, the same people he'd worked with from the very beginning, even after the business grew large enough that he could have afforded the fancy firms in their glass towers. Loyalty meant something to him, consistency meant something, and Mr. Langston had handled every contract and document for Whitaker Yacht Charter since 1972, back when it was still small enough that the whole operation could fit in a single filing cabinet. I arrived 15 minutes early, the way I always did for important appointments, and sat in the waiting room with my purse in my lap and my heart hammering against my ribs. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes who'd brought me water without being asked, kept glancing at me like she wanted to say something comforting, but couldn't find the right words. I wondered what she knew, what Mr. Langston had told her about this meeting, about what was about to unfold. Raymond arrived exactly on time, because of course he did. He'd always been punctual when it mattered to him, when there was something he wanted to gain or protect. He wore a crisp blazer in that expensive shade of blue that only comes from Italian tailors, and Simone was with him, draped in cashmere and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She wore sunglasses even though we were indoors. Even though the day was overcast and gray, the kind of sunglasses that screamed I belong on expensive boats and you don't. Raymond barely looked at me as he walked past. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just a curt nod like I was someone he vaguely recognized from the building directory. Simone didn't even manage that much. She looked right through me as if I was part of the furniture, as invisible and irrelevant as the waiting room chairs. Something cold and hard settled in my stomach then. This wasn't just business to them. This was sport. This was Raymond proving something to his new wife, showing her that he could handle family matters with ruthless efficiency, that sentiment and history meant nothing when money was on the table. I'd seen that look on his face before years ago, when he'd fired a longtime employee right before Christmas because the numbers weren't quite right, when he'd looked at me over dinner and said that business was business and feelings had no place in it. I'd argued with him then. I didn't have the energy to argue now. Mr. Langston called us into his office a few minutes later. The room was exactly as I remembered it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stuffed with legal texts, a massive mahogany desk that had probably been there since the building was constructed, windows that looked out over the harbor where Father's yachts were docked. I could see them from here if I turned my head, white hulls gleaming even in the gray light, and something inside me twisted painfully at the thought of losing them, of never again having the right to walk those decks or stand at those wheels or feel Father's presence in the creak of the boards and the snap of the sails. We sat down, Raymond and Simone on one side, me on the other, Mr. Langston behind his desk like a judge preparing to render a verdict. He was older than I'd remembered, probably close to 70 himself now, with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent reading fine print and navigating other people's family dramas. He'd always been kind to me, always remembered to ask about Clara, always seemed genuinely pleased when I'd stop by the office with Father. Now his face was carefully neutral, professionally blank, but I caught something in his eyes when he looked at me. Sympathy, maybe, or perhaps just the weary recognition of a man who'd seen this scene play out too many times before. He began with the standard formalities, explaining the purpose of the meeting, outlining the basic structure of Father's estate. Raymond was already fidgeting, checking his phone under the table, clearly impatient to get to the part where he won and I lost. Simone had finally removed her sunglasses, and she was examining her manicure with the kind of bored detachment that suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else. Mr. Langston started reading from the trust documents, his voice steady and measured. He covered the cottage first. Yes, it was mine, fully paid for, no strings attached. Raymond nodded slightly, as if confirming something he'd already decided. Then Mr. Langston moved on to the yachts, to Whitaker Yacht Charters, to the heart of everything Father had built. That's when Raymond interrupted. He didn't even wait for Mr. Langston to finish the paragraph, just cut him off mid-sentence with that same dismissive tone he'd used on the phone, telling the lawyer to skip ahead, to get to the transfer paperwork, to make this quick because he had other appointments that afternoon. He said he wanted the ownership documents filed that day, that there was no point dragging this out when everyone already knew how it was going to end. He actually said that. Everyone already knew how it was going to end. I felt something inside me go very still and very quiet, like the moment right before a storm breaks, when the air gets thick and the birds stop singing, and you know something enormous is about to happen but you can't quite see it yet. Mr. Langston looked at Raymond for a long moment. Then he looked at me. And then very deliberately, very carefully, he reached into a folder on his desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward Raymond, and I watched my brother's hand reach for it almost lazily, confidently, like a man who'd already counted his winnings before the game was over. The paper was dated. I could see that much from where I sat. And it was notarized, witnessed, official-looking in the way legal documents are when they're meant to be unbreakable and final. Raymond picked it up, started reading, and I saw his eyes move across the first few lines, saw his expression start to shift from bored confidence to something else, something I couldn't quite identify yet. Mr. Langston spoke then, his voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the silent room. He said there was a clawback provision. Father had added it in 2019, had it witnessed by 2 doctors and the harbor master, had filed it with the corporate registry and made sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. He said father had been very specific about the terms, very clear about the conditions under which it would activate. Raymond's laugh started then, that confident, dismissive sound I'd heard 1,000 times before when someone challenged him or questioned his authority. He said something about father being 92 when he signed this, about diminished capacity, about paperwork that wouldn't hold up if anyone actually examined it closely. His voice had that edge to it, that sharp tone he used when he was trying to intimidate people into backing down. But Mr. Langston didn't back down. He just sat there with his hands folded on his desk and let Raymond finish his laugh, let the sound die away into uncomfortable silence, and then he very calmly, very precisely, began to read what father had written. The words were in father's handwriting. I could see them from across the desk, that familiar script that had labeled my birthday cards and signed my report cards and written out the name Eleanor Marie on the side of his first boat. Mr. Langston read them aloud, and each word fell into the room like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew. If Raymond Whittaker attempts to exclude, redirect, or diminish Eleanor Whittaker's interest in Whittaker Yacht Charters during her lifetime, Mr. Langston's voice was steady, unemotional, a sharp contrast to the meaning behind the words. All ownership interests, dividends, and voting rights held by Raymond shall immediately and irrevocably revert 100% to Eleanor Whittaker. The room went absolutely silent. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process what I was hearing. No appeal, Mr. Langston continued. No exceptions. Raymond's face had gone completely white. I've lived long enough to know that there are moments in life when everything changes, when the world you thought you understood reveals itself to be something entirely different, and you have to sit there in the wreckage of your old assumptions and try to build something new from what's left. I'd experienced that feeling before. When Thomas died suddenly and I realized I'd be finishing my life alone. When Clara moved away and I understood that my daughter had built a world that didn't have room for me in it. But this was different. This wasn't loss. This was something I didn't have a name for yet. Mr. Langston kept talking, his voice filling the terrible silence that had fallen over the room like a heavy blanket. He explained that father had come to him in 2019, 3 years before his death, still sharp-minded and clear about what he wanted. He'd sat in this very office, Mr. Langston said, and he'd talked about his children, about the choices they'd made, about who they'd become. He talked about Raymond's increasing distance, his focus on wealth and status, his tendency to see people as assets rather than human beings. And he talked about me, about the quiet way I'd stepped in to help without being asked, about the hours I'd spent managing the business and caring for him, about how I'd never once demanded recognition or compensation, or even a simple thank you. Father had told Mr. Langston something specific, something he'd wanted the lawyer to remember and repeat if this exact situation ever arose. The words came out now, delivered in Mr. Langston's measured tone, but carrying the unmistakable weight of father's voice, his values, his understanding of his own children. Raymond will try to take it all. That's what father had said. Ellie never asked for anything. If he forgets that, make sure he loses everything he thought he gained. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, hot and sudden and overwhelming. Father had known. He'd seen what was coming years before it happened, had understood his own son well enough to predict this exact moment, this exact betrayal. And he'd protected me, even from the grave. Even when he couldn't be here to stand beside me, he'd made sure I wouldn't be left with nothing, wouldn't be dismissed and discarded like I'd never mattered at all. Mr. Langston continued explaining the legal mechanics of it all. The clawback provision had been filed with the corporate registry. It was active, binding, unbreakable. The moment Raymond had called me after the funeral and told me he was cutting me out of the business, the moment he'd attempted to exclude me from my rightful ownership, the provision had triggered. Automatically. Irrevocably. There was no appeal process, no legal loophole, no way to undo what had already been set in motion. Everything Raymond had thought he was taking, the yachts, the business, the voting rights, the dividends, all of it, had already transferred to me. The papers Mr. Langston had prepared weren't to give Raymond control. They were to formalize what had already happened, to document the transfer of his shares to my name. Raymond still hadn't moved. He was staring at that single page like it had personally reached out and struck him across the face. His mouth was open slightly, His skin that awful grayish-white color that people get when they're in shock, when their brain can't quite process what their eyes are seeing. Simone had grabbed the paper from his hands and was reading it herself, her perfectly manicured finger tracing the lines as if she could find some mistake, some loophole, some way this couldn't possibly be real. But it was real. I could see it in Mr. Langston's face, in the calm certainty with which he'd explained everything. I could feel it in my own chest, in the strange weightless sensation of standing on the edge of something enormous and irreversible. Finally, Raymond found his voice. It came out rough and strained, nothing like his usual confident tone. He said it couldn't be legal, that father hadn't been competent, that surely there were grounds to contest this, to fight it, to make it go away. His hands were shaking now, I noticed, actually trembling as he gestured at the paper, at Mr. Langston, at the whole impossible situation. Mr. Langston's response was patient but firm. He pulled out additional documentation. The medical evaluations from father's doctors confirming full mental competency at the time of signing, the notary's stamp, the witnesses' signatures, the corporate filing records showing the provision had been properly registered and acknowledged by the board. He explained that father had been meticulous precisely because he'd anticipated this reaction, had known Raymond would try to challenge it, had made absolutely certain there would be no avenue for appeal. The provision was airtight. Father had spent 3 years making sure of it. I watched this information land on Raymond, watched each piece of evidence hammer another nail into the coffin of his assumptions. And I watched something change in his expression. The shock giving way to anger, to a kind of desperate fury that made his jaw clench and his eyes go hard. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made me flinch. Simone stood too, instinctively, her hand clutching that expensive handbag like it was a lifeline. Raymond looked at Mr. Langston, then at me, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but hatred. Pure, undisguised hatred. As if I'd personally orchestrated this. As if I'd manipulated father. As if his own choices and actions had nothing to do with where we'd ended up. He didn't speak to me directly, couldn't seem to form words when he looked at me. But he said something to Mr. Langston about getting his own lawyers involved, about this being far from over, about fighting this with everything he had. His voice was shaking now too, cracking around the edges, and Simone was pulling at his arm, whispering something I couldn't hear, clearly wanting to leave, to get out of this room where her wealthy husband had just lost everything he'd counted on. Mr. Langston remained perfectly calm. He said Raymond was welcome to consult with any attorneys he chose, but the provision was clear and legally binding, and any challenge would be both costly and ultimately unsuccessful. He said this kindly, almost gently, the way you might tell someone that the person they're grieving isn't coming back, that some losses are permanent, and fighting them only causes more pain. But Raymond wasn't ready to hear that. He grabbed the paper off the desk, crumpled it in his fist, as if destroying one copy could somehow undo the truth, and turned toward the door. Simone was already halfway there, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor in her hurry to escape. For just a second, Raymond paused in the doorway and looked back at me. Really looked at me for the first time since he'd arrived. I don't know what he saw in my face. I don't know what I was showing him. But whatever it was, it made something in his expression crumble, just for an instant, before the anger slammed back down like a shield. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him and Simone with a soft click that seemed far too quiet for such an enormous moment. The silence that followed was profound. Mr. Langston and I sat there, neither of us moving, and I realized my hands were gripping the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I made myself relax them, made myself breathe, made myself exist in this new reality where everything had just changed. Mr. Langston spoke first. He asked if I was all right, if I needed water, if I wanted to take a break before we continued with the remaining paperwork. His voice was gentle, concerned in a grandfatherly sort of way, and I found myself nodding even though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. He told me then about the conversation he'd had with father when the provision was drafted. Father had been clear-eyed about it, he said, under no illusions about what Raymond had become, or what he would try to do. But father had also talked about me, about the kind of person I was, about what he hoped I would do with the business if this moment ever came. Father hadn't wanted the yachts to become just another luxury service for wealthy people, Mr. Langston explained. He'd wanted them to continue the mission he'd started all those years ago, providing access to the ocean for people who needed it, who couldn't afford it, who deserved that freedom and beauty and healing that only the water could provide. He'd trusted that I would remember that, would honor that, would keep his real legacy alive. The tears came then, hot and fast and unstoppable. I sat in that leather chair in Mr. Langston's office and cried for Father, for the years we'd had together and the years I'd face without him. I cried for Raymond, for the brother I'd loved and the stranger he'd become. I cried for myself, for all the times I'd felt invisible and dismissed and worthless. And for this impossible gift Father had given me. Not just the yachts, but the proof that someone had seen me, had valued me, had loved me enough to protect me even after death. The first thing I did after leaving Mr. Langston's office was drive to the harbor. Not because I had any grand plan. Not because I knew what I was going to do with this impossible inheritance that had just fallen into my lap like a gift from heaven. I drove there because I needed to see the boats, needed to stand on those docks and feel the salt air on my face, and try to make sense of everything that had just happened. It was late afternoon by then, the gray sky starting to darken toward evening, and the marina was mostly quiet. A few boats bobbed gently at their moorings, their halyards clinking against the masts in that rhythmic way that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. I walked slowly down the main dock, my footsteps echoing on the weathered wood, and I let myself really look at what Father had built, what he'd entrusted to me. 12 yachts in total, ranging from the modest 30-footer he'd kept for sentimental reasons, a restored version of that original fishing trawler, the Eleanor Marie, to the flagship vessel, a stunning 60-foot yacht named the Freedom that could sleep 12, and had hosted everyone from terminally ill children to decorated war veterans. They were beautiful, every one of them, maintained with the kind of care that spoke of deep respect and love. The brass was polished, the decks were clean, the paint gleamed even in the fading light. Father's legacy. And now mine. I found myself standing beside the Freedom, my hand resting on her hull, and the weight of it all finally hit me. Not just the financial value, though $95 million was more money than I could properly comprehend, but the responsibility, the trust Father had placed in me, the choice I now faced about what to do with all of it. I could have sold it, I suppose. Raymond would probably have expected that, would have assumed that an 81-year-old woman with no business experience, never mind that I'd been helping run this operation for 6 years, would take the easy path, liquidate the assets, live out her remaining days in comfortable retirement. Part of me was tempted. I was tired. I was old. I'd earned the right to rest, hadn't I? But standing there with my hand on that boat, feeling the gentle rock of the water beneath my feet, I heard Father's voice in my head as clearly as if he were standing beside me. The boats belong to the sea, Ellie, and to the people who need them. I went home that evening and didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I made lists. Not business plans exactly. I'd leave the complicated financial projections to the accountants and managers who'd been running the day-to-day operations. But lists of what mattered, of what Father had valued, of what I wanted his legacy, our legacy now, to become. The phone started ringing the next morning. First the business managers, calling to congratulate me and offer their continued services, assuring me they'd make the transition as smooth as possible. Then the accountants, the lawyers, the harbor master, all the various people whose livelihoods were connected to Whitaker Yacht Charters, all wanting to know what the new owner planned to do, whether jobs were safe, whether the operation would continue. I told them all the same thing. Nothing drastic would change immediately, but I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what Father would have wanted and how to make it real. Raymond called too. 3 times that first week, though I didn't answer. He left voicemails, the first angry and accusatory, demanding I call him back so we could discuss this like reasonable adults. The second more measured, suggesting we meet for coffee, implying there might be room for negotiation if I was willing to be sensible. The third was different, smaller somehow, his voice less certain. He said he just wanted to talk, that we were still family, that surely we could work something out. I deleted each message after listening to it. Not out of spite, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in it. but more because I knew that talking to Raymond right now, engaging with his anger or his bargaining or his attempts at manipulation, would only cloud my thinking. I needed clarity. I needed to figure out who I was going to be now, what kind of owner I wanted to be, what kind of sister I could be to a brother who'd tried to steal from me and only regretted it when he got caught. The clarity came gradually over the following weeks. I started spending more time at the harbor, talking to the captains and crew members, learning the current state of the business beyond just the numbers I'd been tracking in the books. What I found both heartened and troubled me. The company was profitable, very profitable. The luxury charters that Raymond had been so focused on brought in substantial revenue, and the operation was well run and efficient. But somewhere along the way, Father's original mission had gotten lost. The free charters for sick children and veterans, and people who needed the healing power of the ocean had dwindled to maybe 1 or 2 a year, squeezed into the schedule when they wouldn't interfere with paying customers. The boats were being used, certainly, but they were being used by people who could afford to pay premium prices, not by people who needed them most. I understood why it had happened. Raymond had been focused on growth, on profitability, on building the business into something impressive by conventional measures. And he'd succeeded at that. But he'd lost sight of why Father had started this in the first place, of what made it meaningful rather than just profitable. I made my decision on a Tuesday morning in December, sitting in Father's old office, my office now, watching the sunrise paint the water gold and pink. I called an emergency meeting with the management team and laid out my vision. We would restructure. The luxury charters would continue. We needed them to stay financially viable, but we'd dedicate at least 40% of our operating time to free or heavily subsidized charters for people in need. I wanted partnerships with hospitals to take pediatric patients out on the water. I wanted connections with veterans organizations to provide therapeutic sailing experiences. I wanted to work with foster care agencies and homeless shelters and hospice programs, and anyone else who served vulnerable populations that might benefit from a day on the ocean. The managers were skeptical at first. They ran the numbers, showed me the potential revenue loss, warned me that I couldn't run a charity and expect to stay in business. But I'd done my own calculations, with the help of an accountant who understood what I was trying to build. We could afford it. The company was profitable enough to absorb the reduction in revenue, and there were tax benefits and potential grant opportunities for charitable work that could offset some of the costs. More importantly, I didn't care if it made us slightly less profitable. Father hadn't built this business to maximize shareholder value. He'd built it to give people freedom, to share the ocean with those who needed it most. I had $95 million worth of assets under my control. I could afford to use them the way they were meant to be used. We launched the new program in January. The first free charter was for a group of children from the local children's hospital. 8 kids between the ages of 6 and 12. All dealing with serious illnesses, some of them terminal. I went out on that trip myself, stood on the deck of the Freedom, and watched those children's faces transform when we cleared the harbor and hit open water. There was a little girl named Sophie, maybe 7 years old, bald from chemotherapy, so thin and fragile looking I was afraid she might blow away in the wind. But when the sails went up and the boat heeled slightly and we picked up speed, she laughed. A pure, joyful, uninhibited laugh that rang out across the water like a bell. She stood at the railing with the wind in her face and her hands gripping the wood, and she was so completely, radiantly alive in that moment that I had to turn away so no one would see me crying. That's when I knew. Not intellectually, not as some abstract business decision, but in my bones, in my heart, in the deepest part of me that Father had understood and trusted. This was what the boats were for. This was what it all meant. Not the money, not the prestige, not the luxury or the status or any of the things Raymond had valued. Just this. Giving people like Sophie a moment of pure freedom and joy when their lives had been so full of pain and fear. I started sleeping better after that. The tight knot of anxiety and grief that had been living in my chest since Father died began to loosen, to unwind, to transform into something else. Not happiness exactly. I still miss Father terribly, still felt the ache of his absence every single day. But purpose. Peace. The quiet satisfaction of knowing I was doing something that mattered, something that would have made him proud. Raymond called again in late January. This time I answered. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it, smaller, uncertain, almost humble. He said he'd been thinking, that maybe he'd made some mistakes, that he'd like to talk if I was willing. I met Raymond on a Thursday afternoon in February at a small cafe near the harbor. Neutral ground, public enough that neither of us could make a scene. Quiet enough that we could actually talk if talking was what we were going to do. I arrived first, ordered coffee I didn't really want, and sat by the window where I could see the boats in the distance, their masts swaying gently against a sky that had finally cleared after weeks of winter gray. He came in looking older than I remembered, though it had only been 3 months since that awful meeting in Mr. Langston's office. The expensive blazer was gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jacket. No Simone either. He was alone, and there was something diminished about him, something that reminded me painfully of the little boy he'd been before life and ambition had hardened him into someone I barely recognized. We sat in silence for a long moment after he ordered his own coffee, both of us searching for words that felt adequate to the distance between us. Finally, he spoke. He didn't apologize, not exactly, but he said he'd been wrong. About the business, about me, about what Father had wanted. He said he'd spent the past 3 months thinking about the choices he'd made, the person he'd become, and he didn't like what he'd found when he looked honestly at himself. I listened without interrupting, watching his face, trying to gauge how much of this was genuine remorse and how much was just regret at losing what he'd thought was his. It's hard to know sometimes whether people are sorry for what they did or just sorry they got caught, sorry they faced consequences. He told me Simone had left him. She'd stayed for a few weeks after the meeting, but once it became clear that the money was really gone, that there was no legal loophole or last-minute reversal coming, she'd packed her designer luggage and moved on to someone with better prospects. He said it without bitterness, almost with a kind of tired acceptance, like he'd known all along that she'd only been there for what he could provide. Then he asked about the business, about what I'd been doing with it. Not in an accusatory way, not like he had any right to know or any say in my decisions. Just genuine curiosity, maybe even concern. So I told him about the restructured charter program, about the partnerships with hospitals and veterans organizations, about Sophie and the dozens of other children and families who'd been out on the boats since January. I watched something shift in his expression as I talked. Pain maybe, or recognition. The slow, uncomfortable realization of what he'd been too blind to see when Father was alive. That the real value of those boats had never been their price tags or their revenue potential. It had been the lives they touched, the moments of freedom they provided, the way they could take someone's worst day and turn it into something bearable, even beautiful. When I finished, Raymond was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He asked if there was any way he could help. Not with managing the business. He acknowledged he'd lost that right, but with the mission itself. Maybe volunteering, maybe helping coordinate with organizations that serve people who could benefit from the program. He said he had connections, resources, time now that he wasn't consumed with building an empire. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to grab onto this olive branch and pretend the past few months hadn't happened. To go back to being the older sister who forgave everything and made excuses and smoothed over the rough places. That instinct was still there, still strong even after everything. But I'd learned something in the months since Father's death, something important about the difference between forgiveness and trust, between loving someone and letting them hurt you repeatedly. I could forgive Raymond for trying to steal my inheritance. I was working on that, slowly, painfully, in the quiet hours when I let myself feel the full weight of his betrayal. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending it hadn't happened, or that our relationship could just snap back to what it had been before. So I told him the truth. I said I appreciated the offer, but I needed time. Time to run the business my way without his involvement. Time to figure out who I was as an owner and a decision-maker without his shadow over everything. Time to heal from what he'd done and decide what kind of relationship, if any, we could build going forward. I told him I'd loved him my whole life, that some part of me would always love him because he was my brother, because we'd grown up together on Father's boats, because I remembered who he'd been before money and status had twisted him into someone else. But love didn't mean I had to give him access to my life, my work, my peace of mind. Love could exist from a distance, with boundaries, with self-protection built in. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected this answer but hoped for a different one. Then he asked if maybe we could do this again sometime. Just coffee, just talking, no expectations or demands. He said he wanted to try to understand what Father had seen in me, what he himself had been too blind and arrogant to recognize. I said maybe. Not a promise, not a commitment, just an acknowledgement that the door wasn't completely closed, that some future version of us might find a way back to being family in a healthier, more honest way. We parted on the sidewalk outside the cafe, and for just a moment, I saw tears in Raymond's eyes. Real ones, I thought, not manufactured for effect. He said Father would be proud of what I was doing with the boats, and even though part of me wanted to say that Father's pride shouldn't matter to him now, I just nodded and let him have that moment of connection to the man we'd both lost. I watched him walk away, shoulders hunched against the February wind, and I felt something release inside my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever completely, but the beginning of letting go. The start of accepting that some relationships change irrevocably, that some betrayals leave scars that never fully heal, and that it's okay to love someone from a distance while still protecting yourself from further harm. Spring came early that year. By March, the harbor was busy with activity, the regular luxury charters bringing in revenue, the free programs running at full capacity, the boats constantly in motion the way Father had always intended. I hired additional crew members, brought in a development director to help secure grant funding and build partnerships, started planning an expansion that would add 2 more vessels to the fleet specifically dedicated to charitable work. Clara called in April, my daughter who I'd barely heard from in years. She'd somehow heard about what I was doing, maybe from mutual acquaintances, maybe she'd been keeping tabs on me more than I realized. And she wanted to come visit, wanted to see the boats and talk, and maybe start rebuilding what we'd let deteriorate between us. I said yes, though carefully, with the same boundaries I'd established with Raymond. I was learning, slowly, that I could leave doors open without leaving myself vulnerable. The first time I took the Freedom out by myself, just me and 1 crew member for safety, no charter, no schedule, just an afternoon on the open water, I understood something Father had been trying to tell me my whole life. Freedom wasn't about having money or power or control over other people. It wasn't about winning or losing or proving your worth to anyone who'd failed to see it. Freedom was this: the wind in your face, the endless horizon, the knowledge that you'd honored your values even when it was hard, even when it cost you, even when the people you loved couldn't understand why. Freedom was being able to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. I stood at the helm of that boat, my hands on the wheel where Father's hands had been so many times before, and I felt him there with me. Not in some mystical sense. I'm too practical for that kind of thinking, but in the way that people we love never truly leave us. They live on in our choices, in our values, in the way we move through the world and treat other people, and decide what matters when everything else falls away. Father had protected me when I couldn't protect myself. He'd seen my worth when others dismissed it. He'd trusted me with his legacy, not because I was perfect or strong or impressive, but because he knew I'd remember what it was all for, what any of it had ever been for. Raymond calls sometimes now. Not often, maybe once a month, and the conversations are still awkward, still weighted with everything we haven't said and might never say. But his voice is different than it used to be, smaller, yes, but also more real, more honest. He tells me about the volunteer work he started doing at a youth center, teaching business skills to kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. He asks about the boats, about how many people we've served, and he listens when I tell him. I don't know if we'll ever be truly close again. I don't know if I want that, honestly. But we're something to each other still. 2 people connected by blood and history, and a Father who loved us both enough to try to save us from our worst selves, even if he could only fully succeed with one of us. The boats still go out every day. Children still laugh on the decks. Veterans still stand at the rails with tears streaming down their faces, reconnecting with something they'd thought they'd lost forever. And I still stand in Father's office sometimes, looking out at the harbor, feeling the weight and privilege of what he entrusted to me. Sometimes the biggest inheritance isn't the money or the assets or the empire someone built. Sometimes it's simpler than that, more profound. Sometimes it's just the promise someone kept for you when everyone else forgot. The promise that you mattered, that your kindness had value, that the quiet way you loved people and served them and showed up day after day actually meant something. Father kept that promise. And now, every day the boats leave the dock, every time someone experiences the ocean who thought they never would, every moment of freedom and joy and healing that happens on those decks, I'm keeping it too. That's the legacy that matters. That's the inheritance that lasts. And I've never been more free in my life.